get started, everybody. Thanks again so much for being patient with us while we have a few minutes at the start to figure some things out. Welcome to our second 5 for 5 of this season. My name is Courtney Cosden. I'm a soil health instructor with University of Idaho Extension and NRCS. And with me today and always is Lucille Rollins, who is our NRCS soil health specialist. So just a reminder about how the format works with this. So we have 5 awesome speakers on today. They will have 5 minutes to share 5 slides or less, and then we'll take questions immediately following each speaker. And feel free to put questions in the chat if you want, and Lucille or I can read them out when the time comes. So we're kind of switching it up today with today's theme. We have been doing like a fairly livestock integration or cover crops theme for each of these, but today's kind of a fun one called Where Are They Now? So all of the speakers who are presenting today have presented for us on a 5 for 5 in the past. So they're here today to kind of update us on their progress, share what they've learned since they last presented, and maybe even give us some, share a little bit about what they're working on currently. So yeah, we're pretty excited about this. It should be fun to hear from folks again and see some familiar faces. And at the end, we're going to have Travis Youngberg come on, who is with the NRCS, to talk to us about talk to us and highlight one of the NRCS conservation practices. Lucille, remind me if there's anything that I missed, but I think we're good to go. And Lucille is also going to give us a brief update and kind of an introduction before each speaker on what they presented in the past. So unless I missed anything, Lucille, we can get going with that, and you can start us off with Lance.
Yeah, I think we're all set. Okay, so Lance Griff of Griff Farms in the Magic Valley presented in December of 2023. And at that time, he talked about economics of regenerative ag in his operation, in particular, no-till in wheat and corn. And he calculated his savings to come out to $73 per acre with the elimination of 3 passes in the field. And he'd also observed a 20 bushel acre increase in yield in wheat. And so today he's going to be sharing more about no-till and interseeding. Take it away.
Okay, I will share my screen here, make sure that goes smoothly.
Looks great, Lance.
Okay, perfect. So what I've been kind of focusing on the past couple years is growing wider row corn with cover crops. And so one of the goals was to get more diversity into my system because we removed dry beans from our rotation. And so I wanted to get something else, some other diversity into the rotation. So basically the questions I wanted to answer over the past, trying to get answers for the questions of can we get the same, can we get the same yield, same silage yields in corn from wide row corn? So we typically are on 22-inch space corn. And so I wanted to stop planting every other row. So we went to 44-inch space corn. And can I do that interseeded with cover crops? And how does that affect yield? And then another question was, what kind of plant populations of wide row corn do we see the best yields from? So those were a couple questions that I wanted to answer. Okay, so this was Steve Hines with the University of Idaho Extension. We worked on a project together, and we wanted to plant different rates, different seeding rates to see which would yield the best. So we did 5 different planting rates, and then we did 3 different replications of each population. So the different rates were 30,000, 35, 40, 45, and 50,000 rates on the 44-inch row corn. So the cover crop mix that we used was a spring pea, a winter wheat, a purple top turnip, and a daikon radish. And we had done more elaborate mixes in the past, 7, 8, 9, 10-way mixes. And it was difficult on some of those because you would drill those and you would, some stuff would come up, some wouldn't. Some would do really well. You couldn't find some. So we just really kind of wanted to pare it down and see what worked really well. And so we just kind of just pared it down to some things we knew we thought would work. And so those were the 4 that we put in the mix. So we interseeded about June 10th or 12th, I want to say, and the corn was about V3, V4 at that time. And we used the Nature Conservancy United Dairymen's interseeder for that kind of runs around the valley for people to do that with. So the results this past year were, we didn't know what to expect, but so at the 30,000 plant population rate, we averaged 32.4 tons per acre on the 3 different replications. As you can see on the 35,000 population average, we went up to 36.2. At the 40,000 rate, we were at 34.3. At the 45 rate, we were at 34.9. And at the 50,000 rate, we averaged 38.1 tons per acre. So the whole, we wanted to see how did that compare to the whole field, obviously. And the whole field average on traditional 22-inch space rows with no cover crops was 33.2 tons per acre. So we felt like that was, one of the questions we wanted to answer also was this going to hurt yield by going to 44-inch row spacing? And did the cover crops hurt the yield? And in my view, it didn't hurt at all. And we got the diversity out there we wanted. And it, didn't hurt at all. Maybe it's difficult to say because when you plant a whole field and you get your yields back, then obviously your end rows are all figured in there. And when we did did the trials, we had already cut the end rows out. So we were basically already in the field. So you don't have end gun areas that are taking into account where the water doesn't get out there as well and the yield isn't as good. So I was very pleased with the yields and thought it turned out really well. So here's some pictures of the 44-inch row space corn and the cover crop coming up in between the rows. The picture on the left, is smaller as the corn when it's smaller, and the cover crop is doing well there. And we had seen some results from 30-inch space corn, people doing cover crops with it, and even at 30-inch space corn going from 22 to 30, there just didn't seem to be enough sunlight getting down between the rows on the 30-inch. So the 44 seemed like a good compromise. So you can see on the right-hand side there, the cover crops are doing well. You can't really see how tall the corn is here, but I believe this was full-grown corn here. Both of these pictures were as they were chopping the corn. You can see that there's a lot of biomass there. It was still green. It wouldn't have been that green. It would have been dead if we'd have gotten some nice frost before this, but the fall, as you remember, was really nice. We didn't have many freezes, maybe 1 or 2 light freezes at this point. So there really wasn't hard enough frost to kill the cover crop. So as you can see, there's a lot of, biomass left out there. And there was enough sunlight getting down between the rows that the cover crop was able to grow just fine. So I just like these pictures because, as you can see in all these pictures, there's just a lot of, worm activity in these pictures. All these 3 pictures were in that field where we had the cover crop, and you can just see that cottage cheese looking soil on top is just all those worm castings where the worms are coming up and depositing the residue, pulling residue down into the surface. And so I just one measure of how good the surface the soil is doing is the surface of the soil, and you can see that over time the worms have been pulling down the residue that's on the surface and making lots of worm castings. Here's some more pictures. These were actually 2 of these pictures were on a different field where there was a huge amount of residue on this surface when we planted this corn, and by the end of the season there was very little residue left, and you can see there's a lot of worm castings there, and it just makes me really happy to see all that going on. The other 2 on the right hand side, you can see especially that one clear on the far right, where you couldn't see that wormhole, that huge wormhole that was there, but you could see a big pile of worm castings above it. So if you moved it aside with your hand, you could see there was a lot of worm castings above it, and then there was this huge hole that the worms were using to go in and out. So just love to see the biology really cranking along and the worms doing well. So I guess that's it for me. Any questions?
Thank you, Lance.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you add the worms, Lance, and or did they just show up on their own with the suitable environment? And then where are you located again?
Yeah, so I'm located south of Filer. We're kind of spread out a little bit south of Filer and south of Twin. So we're out on the salmon track. I'm about 9 miles south of Filer, basically. And yeah, the worms just show up. It seems like you provide the habitat, have some residue on the surface, don't till. I'm not going to say that I don't till, because a lot of times after this corn silage, we'll go out and till with a high-speed disc once, possibly twice, and then go plant winter wheat after this. So it just depends on how wet the soil is when the choppers get there. Sometimes you don't have a lot of control over that. Sometimes the chopper guy's schedule gets messed up, and we try to turn our water off 10 days to 2 weeks before the choppers get there, and that way the soil is not wet when they get there and they don't compact the soil. Because we have been playing with and have had good luck with using a no-till drill and just drilling winter wheat into the corn residue, what's left after they've chopped it. Even after the heavy corn choppers and trucks have gone on the field, we haven't seen any compaction issues as long as we turn the water off soon enough that it's not being compacted when they drive on it.
Lance, I'm curious. In my experience, I've had a lot of issues using wheat around corn, and I had some sort of allelopathy or something going on. Did you notice any effects like that in your cover mix?
I have not. I have not. I have noticed with cover crops and just planting into more residue that the corn is slower early in the season. It just doesn't come up as quickly, it seems like, and just is kind of slower for that first month. That's about the only thing I've really seen with it. But it seems like once you get into about 4th of July and you really start getting those heat units, the corn just takes off and holds moisture better, and just so many more benefits. But no, I really haven't seen those issues.
I've got a question for you, Lance.
Sure.
So it sounds like this was done as part of a trial. So do you have plans to, or have you already implemented this on a broader scale?
I have not. We did this on half a pivot, which is what we did last year, the previous year also. So we did this in 2013, but it was not scientific at all. We just said, hey, let's try 44-inch row corn. We didn't mess around with populations. We just planted a half a pivot on the 44-inch row corn. And then we planted, interseeded the cover crops. And then it was kind of like let's see what happens type of thing. It did well, yielded well, and then so we said, okay, we need to get more scientific about this, and okay, what populations are gonna do the best here, and so I think Steve Hines and I have talked about doing this again this next year, and I think if that goes well, then we'll take this full scale and potentially do this on a lot more acres.
Okay, nice. And you got some questions in the chat. Barry Dilkey asked, in future corn plantings, do you attempt to plant in the cover crop row?
We typically, that doesn't work in our situation because we typically will just disc it up because we're not using it for feed or anything like that. So the goal for me was just the diversity. And so I just disc it up and then we just go drill winter wheat. So no, I don't plan on re-drilling or planting in the cover crop rows.
Okay, and then another one from David Huber. Lance, did you test your soils before and or after the interseeding? Sounds like you've got a lot of good observations.
I did not. We typically take soil samples every year, although that's not super scientific as far as biological activity. you can see some organic matter increases from that sometimes. But I have not been, regularly taking soil health test. I haven't been doing a lot of those tests.
Any other questions for Lance?
I'll shoot him one more. I'm curious, how did you get around herbicide use with as far as timing and your cover crop interseeding?
Yeah, so we sprayed our corn, and then within, I want to say it was within a week, we were out there drilling the cover crop, and we didn't see any kind of carryover, no issues. We just used Roundup and Status on the corn, and Status has a little bit of residuals, what they say, and we didn't see any kind of issues. Didn't, cover crop came up fine, came up well, and so that's how we dealt with it. We just sprayed the corn first. It was pretty small corn, but went ahead and sprayed it, and then did the cover crop, and then didn't have to worry about killing any kind of cover crop after that if we tried to spray after that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing, Lance. That's great. I love to see the pictures of the soil. It's awesome to see the earthworms working. That's really cool. Alrighty, Alayne, if you are ready, you can pull up your screen and Lucille's going to do a little intro for you.
All right.
All right. Great. Okay. So Alayne Blickle owns Sweet Pepper Ranch in Nampa and is the director of Horses for Clean Water. She presented in February 2021, and at that time shared with us about the rotational grazing she practiced with her horses and the use of their composted horse manure on their pasture and surrounding grounds. And it sounds like today she's going to talk more about her work as an educator and the soil-related content that she teaches. Thanks, Alayne.
Yeah, thank you for asking me back again. So I'm in Nampa, Idaho, and we have a 10-acre property where we do boarding and lessons and clinics and training. My husband's a trainer. We also have a glamping tent. In the summer, we do have people staying overnight in that, and we have a horse motel in the summer. So we try to monetize the property in different ways. But as Lucille said, I'm an educator and I teach about conservation practices for small acreage livestock owners. And Lucille asked me to talk about how reducing mud and dust on horse properties can improve soil health. And my answer to that is to implement a pasture management plan. So in both of these cases here, they have no pasture management plan. And when they're overgrazing, like in the situation above, that's going to be compacting the soil and compromising the roots of the plants start reabsorbing the roots when they get below about 3 to 4 inches. And then in the bottom property, there is no pasture management plan there. They're pretty much on the pasture in the foreground 24/7. So it's compacted and it's literally just mud and no plants. So you're also going to have soil erosion in those situations, both with the mud in the wintertime and the dust in the summertime, losing valuable topsoil. So in pasture management, the heart of pasture management for horse owners of any size acreage is to have a confinement area. And the confinement area is basically like an area that you're giving up for the sake of the rest of your pasture. And you expect that grass is never going to grow in this area, but you're going to have to do different things to mitigate the mud and the manure. So we teach things like putting down footing and having gutters and downspouts and having a manure management plan. And then using the confinement area is what helps you avoid these kinds of situations. So during the wintertime, during the rainy season, when you're irrigating, during storm events, that's when we encourage people, and that's when we on our property keep our horses in their confinement areas. to avoid that kind of overgrazing and compacting. And in the wintertime, this is actually one of our neighbor properties that treats their pasture basically like a giant confinement area. And so it gets compacted, it gets overgrazed, those roots get reabsorbed, you have mud and manure and runoff, as well as poor soil health. So the way that I like to encourage people to manage their pastures is with a rotational grazing system, which is what we do in the bottom left-hand corner. I teach people to get to know their ruler or yardstick so they know what 3 to 4 inches is, because that's where they should cut it off for their grass plants. And then 6 to 9 inches is when they can put their horses back on. And we talk about putting horses into smaller grazing areas so that you can control them more like a lawnmower and keep them in an area like just a few amount of days. We usually do 3 to 5 days. It depends on the number of horses and the size of the grazing area that we use. And then we move them on to another area. And what we use is temporary materials and posts to move it around our pasture so that we can utilize different parts of our pasture, because we also hay our pasture as well. And yeah, so the healthy roots feed the microorganisms, as you guys probably know, which builds up the soil food web and makes for a happier situation, better plant growth, better health for the horses, and better for the environment as well, less runoff. And it also helps to contribute with reducing climate change. I like to teach about that and intersperse that into what I talk about. So that's it. And I've got a lot of information on my website. I've got tip sheets. Some of them are free, like my Firewise one. I've got a newsletter, and that's Horses for Clean Water in 5 minutes. Any questions?
Thank you, Alayne. Yeah, it's good to hear from someone. We hear from a lot of folks with big acreage. So it's nice to hear from someone with a little bit smaller acreage. So that's really important for a lot of homeowners too, who maybe have livestock and need strategies so that their pastures don't turn into dirt.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of horse owners in Idaho, as well as small acreage livestock owners for other kinds of livestock.
Excuse
Well,
me.
you've got it. Oh, go ahead.
I'm a 10-acre farm, and I'm a landscape architect, so I raise native plants in one area, and
Right.
I have a couple of horses, and I need to reseed some of my pasture areas, and I'm wondering if you could give me some tips on the best combination of grass and forb seeds that you've used.
Yeah, so I am not sure that there's any forbs that I'd necessarily recommend in a horse pasture, but I do recommend a lot of native plants and I have a lot of tip sheets on it too. We have pollinator hedgerows and wind barriers and barriers between neighbors, privacy barriers that are all native plants on our property. So reseeding your pasture, I encourage people to overseed it instead of completely renovating it, because it's so hard on the soil when you do that. And you have to keep your horses off for at least a year, so it lets those grass plants get established. We have what we call the pull test, and that's if you can get down on your hands and knees and pull that grass plant out by its roots, then you know your horse is going to be able to do that. So you have to set aside that area for at least a year to let it get established. And you're probably going to have to use, still do pasture management, like maybe some mowing and maybe some weed control for that area, and still manage it. And it'll take about a year, but then it'll be in a better, the roots will be in a better place for you to put your horses on it. Sometimes if people have a whole big area that they want to renovate, I suggest maybe dividing it up into quarters and starting with 1 quarter at a time, so that they still have the other areas to use as turnout if they want. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm at 5,500 feet in the
Mm.
Winter Valley. So I have the glaciers gifted us with a great quantity of rock in our soil. We don't have a horizon and a B horizon. We have a B horizon
Yeah.
from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have my pasture already fenced so that it's divided into 3 sections, so I can move animals around. I raise chickens, usually somewhere between 500 and 600 chickens. And so the chickens can help with the fertilizer aspects, and they eat some of the species that the horses won't eat, as well as cleaning up my vegetable garden areas at the end of the season. But I do need to do a reseeding in one of the pastures. I had a very bad toadflax infestations that I've been killing off. So I'm trying to reseed now. And so I'm wondering what grass species would be best to utilize, and if there are any other. Would you recommend any clover or alfalfa or any of those kinds of species in a pasture?
Yeah, so I always recommend that people contact their conservation district or NRCS or extension for localized information that's specific for their area, like the soil type and the elevation and the weather, microclimates, that kind of thing. Usually it's going to be some combination of fescue and orchard grass, but there's bromes that grow really well in this part of the country as well. Usually you don't want the clovers. I mean, they are really good for soil health because they fix nitrogen, but they can in a horse pasture, they can often outcompete the grass because the grass tends to get overgrazed in a horse pasture. And then some of the clovers can have health issues for the horses, like well, you definitely don't want crimson clover, but red clover and Alsike clovers can have adverse health issues for horses. So I just steer away from them in a horse pasture, but talk to your conservation district to find out what seed types they are recommending for your specific area, or email me if you want some more one-on-one help with it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So
Any-
Lane, some questions actually came through the chat.
Oh, okay.
So Brett asked, have the horses naturally adapted or been trained to these sorts of rotational movements?
Oh yeah, very quickly. Horses, yeah, they totally get used to it. On this property, we have to lead them out from the stalls. Where we lived 20 years ago in Washington, some of the grazing areas were right off of their paddocks, which is by the way, a really chore efficient way to set it up. Like sometimes that grazing system is called a wheel and spoke, where you would just open up the grazing areas right off of the paddocks. But in Washington, our horses would look for the next grazing area, and we could just let them out of their paddocks and they'd hustle right over to wherever we had moved the grazing area to. And they're like, we want to get down to eating, so just show us where we need to go. But here we have to lead them out. It's a little bit of ways from their confinement areas. So yeah, no, they totally get used to it. You know, with some horses, you do have to have hot wire that is hot, but they're pretty sensitive to hot wire. We also do a lot of night grazing in the summertime when it's really hot. The sugars are lower in the grass, and it's much better for horses to have low sugar grass. So it works out really well in the summer.
Okay, and another one from Barry. Since you are grazing horses, is pasture species diversity less important?
No, I mean, I don't think there's a lot of studies on that, but like I've seen with other livestock, with like, if any of you know Fred Provenza, you know, with other animals, diversity is really important. So I personally think it's got to be important for horses. When we feed hay, you don't want to change a horse's diet very quickly, but you know, we feed different kinds of grass hay, and we try to work that in. And yeah, I think diversity is probably still important with horses, but as far as I have seen, I haven't seen studies with horses, but I certainly know diversity is important in all of the environment and ecology. So one can only assume it is as well with horses.
Okay, and then the last one, bringing it back to soils. Are there certain characteristics to look for in a confinement area in terms of slope, moisture, soil, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. Like I teach a whole class in how to set up a confinement area. You want to find a high, well-drained area. And, you know, if you could look at the soil survey for your property and find out which areas are like more rocky, they would be less suitable for pasture and more suitable for your confinement areas in your buildings, because they're going to have less mud. So yeah, definitely you want a high, well-drained area. And it'd be good if you could have some slope away from your barn for your confinement areas so that they will drain a little bit better. You don't want them right up by your property line just because of being considerate of your neighbors. And then you also want it convenient for chores, for like manure management and those kinds of chores. Getting footing into your paddocks, you want to have your confinement areas convenient so you can have deliveries of gravel or sand, whatever kind of footing you decide to use. Does that help?
I think so. That was a great answer. Thanks, Alayne.
Sure.
Yeah, Kian said yes, that does help.
Okay, good. Well,
Awesome.
thank you for having me.
Thanks so much
Yeah,
for coming,
thank you.
Alayne. All righty.
Shall I go ahead and?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Tyson, you can load
Okay.
up and Lucy will introduce you.
Okay. All right, everybody. So Tyson Meeks of Meeks Farm in southwestern Idaho presented in December of 2021. He walked us through the Johnson-Su method of composting and then his process for transforming the microbes from a solid medium to a liquid medium, which can then be spread more easily in the field. And today he's sharing more about compost and going no fertilizer in corn.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Yes, my name is Tyson Meeks. I am primarily a row crop farmer here in southwest Idaho. And for the last several years, apparently at least since 2021, I've been using the Johnson-Su bioreactor method of making compost. We settled on this strategy for a number of reasons. The biggest one being that it doesn't require any turning which is a big deal if you're limited on labor like I am. But also it has some other benefits. It's very fungal dominant, aerobically produced, and it's fairly easy to work with. And we're able to take a pile the size of a pallet. We can liquefy it with a fairly simple process and put it in the seed furrow at planting time, so it gets right in there with the seed and gets everything off to a nice start. Which brings me to my favorite set of pictures probably ever. So this photograph on the left, that's a corn seed, that pink thing right there. Right through the middle of the picture here is the seed furrow, and you can see all these white filaments of fungal colonies getting established. And this is before that corn seed's ever seen the daylight. So things happen pretty quick with this strategy. By comparison, this photograph on the left is a neighbor's field, just totally conventionally farmed. You can see it's pretty much corn and dirt, and that's about it. So I really feel like this strategy helps get our crops off to a nice healthy start. Since this photograph was taken, as much as I can, I get untreated corn seed, get all those fungicides and everything out of my system. And so far it's been working beautifully with both fungal protection and insect protection. So the seedlings really get rolling. What I really wanted to focus on today is I've got a 20-acre field here that has had very little conventional fertilizer over the last, oh, it's going on 10 years now even. Kind of lost track, but anyhow, it's really done well keeping, you know, we're utilizing a lot of different soil health practices, including the compost. And yeah, so I wanted to highlight how that played out in 2024 in the last grain crop, was the grain corn. So to start with, I just wanted to bring up my soil test on that field. Everything highlighted in yellow here is the results from that particular field. But what I really wanted to focus on is circled there in blue. That's the nitrates, just to try and prove that I'm not hiding a whole bunch of nitrates in my soil profile somehow. So according to this test, I have somewhere around 22 pounds of total nitrates in my soil per acre. And if you know anything about growing corn, that's not enough to do basically anything if you ask the experts. And that being said, here is the results from the 2024 corn harvest. The compost field that has had basically zero fertilizers on this right side. A conventional field right next to it that I farm is on the left side here. So you can see we went from around 180 bushel to almost 220 bushel corn yield, which came out to about $207 worth of actual dollars in my pocket just from the yield increase. And then there's $145 worth of fertilizer on the conventional field that I did not have to spend, so I got that money back in my pocket as well. So yeah, $352 per acre, net swing. I really feel like that's a winner every year. And this field it does it every year. It makes me totally nervous at planting time, not having all that fertility out there that the experts say I just have to have. But year after year, it produces farm average results with zero fertilizer, and yeah, things are working well. So that's what I wanted to highlight today, and I'll just kind of leave it open for questions at this point.
That's incredible, Tyson. It's so cool to hear that you're not putting on any fertilizer, especially on corn, which we all know is a pretty heavy feeder crop. We can take questions for Tyson.
I'd like to know more about your composting system. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works?
For sure. So the basic Johnson Sioux bioreactor, and you can look up all the specs on the website. I believe it's University of California at Chico, if I remember right. But anyhow, it's all set up on a pallet, basically. That gives you a reference for size, and then you put a kind of a basket around it, fill it up, and then just kind of let it sit. We try and keep ours, out of the most extreme weather the best we can, try and keep it in the shade in the summertime and that kind of thing. But otherwise, it's basically just kind of keep it moist and let the microbes do their thing. But if assembled correctly, it should it should be totally aerobic. I like to throw some earthworms in it, after the first few weeks when there's no chance of it heating back up again, just to help aerate it, and they do their thing as well as far as microbes go. It does take a long time. The minimum suggested time to let a pile sit is 1 year, so there is a fair lead time involved here. So we're always trying to keep making couple piles every year. That way we can keep this process moving out into the future.
What sort of materials are you putting in, Tyson? And are you chopping those materials, or how are you prepping them?
I use about whatever I can scrounge up around the farm. I've really had about the best luck with like tree leaves. If you can find somebody's yard that dumps, like 6 inches of leaves on the ground at basically in a week or something, and go rake those up. That's a real easy way to collect materials. But I've used everything from like old hay bales, old straw bales, manure from our sheep, um, well, and leaves, grass, basically anything I can scrounge up in a fair quantity. I try to tend more towards what they call brown materials, so more like the leaves and the straw, as opposed to green materials like grass clippings and that kind of thing. Just because the brown materials make better fungal food, and I've got more than enough bacteria, so I don't really feel like feeding them.
Jen, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, well, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, both a comment and a kind of a general question. Tyson, I've loved all these presentations. They're super inspiring and really interesting, and this has just been one of my favorite 5 for 5. So thank you for organizing this. Tyson, I guess my question is more on communication. You've done a really wonderful job communicating this to us, and I would love for this message to get out to the general public, especially at this time when we're seeing such horrible cuts to a lot of our USDA folks, about the importance of agriculture and both the economic viability of sustainable agriculture and its importance. So I guess any suggestions from you or the rest of the group on how we can make sure the public knows the importance of the USDA and agriculture?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Getting the message out, I've discovered, has been challenging until people come looking for the message. It's been hard to broadcast it out for general consumption. Um, I've had the most luck with just kind of local soil days and talking to neighbors and that kind of thing as far as spreading the word. But I certainly feel like, Courtney's got a good thing going here with this 5 for 5 business. So hopefully things like this can maybe ignite the fire a little faster.
That's a great answer. I totally agree. So yeah, Courtney, keep it up. And Tyson, that's helpful to hear about. I think it's a good time to chat with all of our neighbors. So yeah, good suggestion.
Well, and we do a lot of our field days and everything in the Magic Valley. And Tyson and I have been talking for a couple of years about trying to do some more field days in the Treasure Valley. So I'm hoping maybe this year will be the year where we finally figure that out. Alayne, do you want to ask your question? Then we'll go to the questions in the chat.
Yeah, Tyson, I know I should know the answer to this, but can you say again why the fungal dominated compost is important? Otherwise it'd be bacterial dominated, I think. Is that right? Can you tell me the difference and why it's important?
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. The key difference, or the key strategy, I don't know, idea at play here is most of your typical crops, let's say cash crops, and corn, it falls definitely in this bucket. I've heard the ideal ratio in your soil for fungi to bacteria is somewhere around 1 to 1. Given our long history of pesticides, fertilizers, and tillage, and all the other fun stuff we've done to destroy our soils, typically the average row crop soil is somewhere around 10 bacteria to 1 fungi, so it's very heavily bacterial dominated. So by bringing in this fungally dominated soil or compost material, the goal is to help shift the microbial population more to fungal dominated as opposed to bacterial. Now that being said, it's not a standalone technique. Anytime you throw these fungal spores out into the soil, they need something to eat on. They need soil structure. They need air to breathe, water to drink, and yeah, material to digest. So it's one tool in the bucket, but I think it's important.
So, if I can follow up with that, so do you think that compost, that just normal compost, wouldn't be as beneficial as your fungal dominated compost is for your pastures? That's what I was wondering too.
Well, and this is where the term compost gets convoluted. There's such a wide range. Some compost is really just a good source of potassium and phosphate. It has very little microbial use at all. Other compost is very bacterially dominated because it gets turned and it's a very quickly produced process. Other is very fungally dominated. So it's hard to kind of give a blanket answer to that. Every compost pile is somewhat different.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions in the chat for you too, Tyson. First one, do you use alfalfa in your rotation to get some nitrogen in the soil?
No, we are not uh, alfalfa producers at all. Some fields do have a pea rotation every 4 or 5 years. I don't believe this particular field's had peas for a long while now. But there's a lot of other ways to get nitrogen in the soil besides legumes. I think legumes are very overrated in their capacity. There's a lot more other strategies to use.
Okay, where do you get your worms from?
Oh, I dig them out of the ground. For the compost, I have actually gone just to the local bait shop and just bought a little bucket of worms to chuck in there. Sometimes that's easier, but um, like Lance said earlier, as soon as you start having good habitat, the worms just show up. So it's really no big deal to dig them up. You just wait for a good rainstorm and pick them up off the ground even.
Another question from Lance, do you use any manure in your system?
Uh, that's a convoluted question. We haven't really used any manure for the last probably 20 years now. But back in the 90s and early 2000s, we hauled a lot of manure out of a dairy that's literally across the street. So you may notice on like the soil test that we have a pretty good supply of phosphate and potassium built up in our soil. That's from all those years of hauling manure back in the late 90s.
A question about how do you keep the system from freezing, and have you noticed any issues with that? And roughly at what rate are you applying it when seeding?
As far as freezing goes, depending on how badly I need the space in my shop, I will move my compost piles in the shop. When they're the size of, when they're on pallets, they're fairly easy to move around and they don't take up a huge amount of space. And then that way, I can kind of keep it halfway heated with the wood stove. Or the other strategy I've used is just let them freeze in the winter and I just kind of deduct that time off the year that it takes to mature that pile out. So, it might take me a year and a half or something by the time I subtract out a couple winters or a hot summer or something like that. And as far as use rates go, I believe Dr. Johnson says one pallet size pile will cover some ridiculous amount, like 600 acres or something when you get it liquefied. By that measure, we tend to ladle it on. We probably use one pile on maybe 150 to 200 acres, something like that. So, in terms of pounds of dry compost, it's like a half a pound or something of compost per acre, but we're really after that microbial inoculant more than anything else.
Awesome. And I think you answered Sarah's question with that. How many do you currently have going?
Right now, I think I've just got the one pile prepped for this spring. So I need to get another one going to have it ready for the spring of 26.
Maybe we can come out and watch you build the pile soon. I'll call you.
It's not much of a spectator sport, I'll admit that. It's pretty much just shoveling things into a bin.
Maybe we could help you shovel then.
Well, I won't argue with that.
Okay, last question from Barry. Do you feel this process would be beneficial to a pasture-based system?
Let me think about this. I think it probably has some benefit. I don't know that it would be as much. I'm just thinking in terms of once you kind of get that microbial inoculum out there and get it started, as long as you can keep it fed, I feel like the system would kind of just propagate itself, and in theory should kind of just keep going ad infinitum that way.
Okay, actually, we have one more question for you, Tyson. You've been doing a great job. How do you apply to the field?
So it's actually a pretty simple process to wash the microbes out of that compost. Um, so we can wash, I don't know, 250 gallons into one of those big totes. I don't know, it takes maybe an hour or something to get that much liquid, and then we're set up to apply fertilizer or any kind of liquid with our planter set up. So we just use that same system, whether we're putting down conventional fertilizer on other fields or our liquid compost. We're able to just squirt it right down the seed furrow, about 20 gallons to the acre. It's pretty simple, really. It's stupidly simple almost.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all that information, Tyson.
Hey, happy to be here and help.
Yes, we're happy you're here. Okay, and yeah, now we have our last presentation. Mary Wolf, if you want to pull up your screen, and Lucille can give an intro for you.
All right, so Mary is last, but certainly not least of our returners. So she's an agronomist at the Plant Materials Center in Aberdeen, and she's been on the 5 for 5 a couple of times to share the results of her cover crop trials. So one of those was an evaluation of warm season cover crops, and the other an introduction on her 2-year research into optimal seeding rates for individual cover crops. And the results of those research efforts included a list of winners for warm season cover crops, and then practical guidance that higher seeding rates may not be worth the extra cost. So today she's sharing about cool season cover crops. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, good. So I'm Mary Wolf. I'm the agronomist at the Aberdeen Plant Materials Center here in Idaho. And this presentation is going to be kind of a fast-paced trailer, as it were, for the upcoming final study report for cool season cover crop seeding rates for biomass and canopy cover, which is getting published this spring. We looked at seeding rates for 8 different commonly planted cover crop species: winter barley, oat, hybrid turnip, radish, winter wheat, facultative triticale, which is triticale that can, depending on how you plant it, be either fall or spring, and hairy vetch and Austrian winter peat. So our goal was to, for each one of these species, have a bracket of 4 different seeding rates, going from just ridiculously low to really high, like an agronomic planting rate for that crop, just to see what happens at these different rates. with the idea that none of these are ever going to be planted as single species cover crops, right? But we would have a better idea of, if you're planting a cover crop mix, what's the right rate for each species to be planted into that mix. And so once we planted those, we evaluated them for biomass at 2 months after planting, which would have been mid-October, and then pre-termination. And depending on the species, pre-termination for things that were going to freeze out, like oats, radish, and the turnips, they terminated themselves in November. And then the species that made it through the winter, I called termination mid-April, and then we sprayed them out after that. And then we also looked at canopy cover. So I looked at that monthly, starting at 1 month after planting. And this was a 2-year study, planted in mid-August in 2021, and again in 2023. And mid-August, because that's after wheat harvest in our area. So, like I was just saying, I took monthly photos of the plots, and I ran them through an app called Foliage, and that app will take every photo, and I took them down, like looking straight down on the plot, and it takes all the pixels that are green and transforms them to white, and any pixel that's a different color, it transforms it to black, and then it can count and get what's your percentage of white pixels, and that's your percent of canopy cover. So the image that you see here is radish canopy at 1 month after planting, and going across the top, that's the photos of the 4 different rates: 2.5, 5, 7.5, and 10 pounds an acre seeded. And then along the bottom, you see for each one of those rates, the corresponding amount of cover. So 28, 44, 64, and 93. And I did that monthly and turned that into these graphs on the next slide. And in the final study report that's coming out, I have every species for both years of the study. We don't have time to get that much into detail right here, but it is in the study report. And in this image, I'm showing canopy cover for barley on the left in 2023, turnip on the right in 2023 at 1, 2, and 3 months after planting, and for each of the 4 rates. And what you can see here is that for barley and for turnip, there were differences in canopy cover 1 month after planting, but by 2 and 3 months after planting, you got the cover. It really didn't matter what your seeding rate was. This was generally true for all the small grains and all the brassicas. The legumes, less so, because as you know, they kind of get off to a slow start. But the take home for canopy cover is that if you just need cover out there on your land because you're concerned about wind erosion or whatever, you just don't want the raindrop or the wind touching the soil surface, it kind of doesn't matter what rate you plant. You're going to get your cover. And then I also got biomass at 2 months after planting, and like I was saying, at pre-termination, whenever that was for each particular species. The graph here is biomass, dry pounds an acre, at 2 months after planting, which was mid-October each year. So each color represents one of the 8 species, and the lighter bar on the left is the 2021 value. The darker bar on the right is the 2023 value, and there are the 4 different rates along the bottom for each one of those species. And this really gives you an idea of the fall forage produced. So unlike cover, if you want biomass, if you want, you want that biomass, like either putting photosynthate into the soil and increasing your soil health, or you planted that cover crop for forage in the fall, higher seeding rates maybe are the way to go. But if you look at the graphs, you'll notice that for a lot of the species, planting at the highest seeding rate really doesn't get you that much more biomass. And another thing I want to point out here is, say for oat, that's the yellow bars, you can see that the 2023 values at 2 months after planting were like crazy higher than in 2021. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on there once I got all the data together. And by 3 months after planting, which basically that was right before the oats froze, they had caught up. So the biomasses at that point look similar, and this graph just doesn't show that. And so like I was saying, this report is coming out this spring. It's in final review right now, and as soon as I get the sign off on it, it's going to be published on the NRCS plant materials website in all its detail. It's like 18 pages long with tables and graphs and everything like that. And it will be available on the plant materials website. You go to technical documents and you just search in the box IDPMC. It's kind of complicated. I actually don't love our website. So if you have trouble getting to it, email me. And if you like want to discuss what's going on in that study or something doesn't make sense to you, I would be happy to talk to anybody about it. And that's all I have right now, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. We'll definitely look out for that publication and try to get the info out when it comes out. Who has questions for Mary?
Were there any mixes done here, or were they all just planted monoculture?
These were all planted monoculture just to see how each species would behave individually at a particular rate. And like, this is in no way an endorsement of having single species cover crops. Like, we're all about the mixes. This is just geared towards helping people not put on too much seed. So I guess the next step would be how low of a seeding population of mixes could be planted and still get the cover and biomass that people want. This was just kind of like the first step.
Oh, go ahead, Lucia.
A question came through the chat for you, Mary, from Barry. Could I get a copy of the biomass chart? When planting for fall grazing, I use cold kill degrees. For example, collards, rape, and kale will go to 0 to 5 degrees to cold kill.
Yes.
So I guess that was a question and a comment. Oh,
yes.
Go ahead.
So I did the same thing with the cold kill. So I had those temperatures for the oats and the turnips and the radishes. And so I was watching the weather really, really closely because I wanted to go out there and get that final biomass before that crop froze. So yeah, I was like on the weather forecast constantly. And then Barry, if you could send me an email and I will give you a copy of that biomass chart. Because that one's actually not in the final report, but if anyone's interested in having it, I will happily send it to you. And that's my email address on the last slide.
Mary,
okay. Yeah, I see Aaron's question. Is there a seeding rate range that you would recommend? So it really depends on what your purposes are. So earlier in the talk, I was saying, if you just want cover, if you want to stop wind erosion or water erosion in the winter, you could get away with a lighter rate. And if you're after biomass, you're going to want to seed a little heavier. And there's no like overarching, like for all situations, the second highest rate was the best. Because I mean, plot science never looks that pretty. which was kind of distressing to me when I kind of was putting this all together. But when you read the final report, I think that you'll get an idea of what's appropriate for each one of these species based on what the goals are, if that answers your question.
Mary, how do you see this comparing with what producers are generally putting on for cover crop for their seeding rates?
My understanding of it is that there's a lot of a range with what people are putting on in cover crop mixes. And sometimes people who, they want to save money because cover crops seed is expensive, and maybe they had a cost share with NRCS before and that's over and they're doing it on their own. They might tend to go a little bit light, and that might be okay for cover, but like if you want to put your animals on it in the fall, you might not be very happy with it. And I've also heard situations where, seed companies, they want to sell cover crop seed, right? So they can set somebody up with this luxurious cover crop mix and the rates are kind of high and they're not really seeing a lot of bang for their buck, and they might be disappointed in how much money they spent on cover crop seed. So really the whole point of this study was, when this was first suggested to me by Travis and Derek Tilley, the PMC manager here, it was called the cheapo cover crop trial. Like it was all about like, how little can you put on to meet your goals?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a really important question. Are there any other? Oh, go ahead, Mary.
Oh, eventually, it's because some places have cover crop calculators, right? Kind of like the range seeding, the CPA 25 that we have. So you'll put like all the species you want in a pasture or range seeding, and then what percent you want, and we have like a given seeding rate for that. So eventually, I think Idaho NRCS is going to have a cover crop mix calculator, and then the rates in this final study report could go into that calculator based on their goals.
Excellent. Any other questions for Mary?
I'd like to just throw a comment out there in this particular situation for cool weather cover crops, especially if you're looking for fall grazing or biomass. I've had a lot of luck with spring peas of all things, and I think they get overlooked a lot. So I just wanted to throw that out there if anybody's considering a fall mix.
Thank you very much. That's good to know.
Another comment from Barry, not being a wheat producer, I often use cereal rye in the winter cover crop mix, both for soil health and grazing.
There are so many people who love cereal rye. And in the Great Plains states and in the Midwest, like they'll talk about a cover crop mix, and it's like 4 kinds of cereal rye. That's their cover crop mix, which to us is, a little bit weird. But the issue and why NRCS doesn't promote cereal rye as a cover crop, and I think last I heard, like we won't pay on it in a mix that we fund, is that it can go feral and become a weed in wheat. And if like, you not being a wheat producer and your neighbors not being a wheat producer, you're probably fine. But we've had the Idaho Wheat Commission contact us at the PMC and just basically be like, please no.
I've heard that from folks too. One you gotta keep an eye on.
Yeah,
I get a lot of calls as a state agronomist about that specific issue from the grain growers and others when they hear that NRCS might be putting that out there. I did talk to one of the state agronomists in the Midwest who has one of the premier cover crop guys. He's been in No-Till magazine several times. And I talked to him about cereal rye, and he's like, yeah, I wouldn't do it if I were you where you're growing wheat. But he says in our corn systems, it works great. So he did say there's other stuff, and U of I has said the same thing. There's other things like triticale that are very good, and have a lot of the same traits.
Well, this is a perfect segue into your presentation, Travis. Travis is going to share with us a bit about the NRCS cover crop conservation practice. If you're ready to go, Travis.
All right.
Thank you so much again, Mary.
Let me know if you can see it here. I can get it to the
Oh,
view.
yep. There you go. Perfect.
All right. I'm going to talk a little bit just about cover crops, and I'm going to keep it fairly short. There's so many things that I could talk about when it comes to cover crops, stuff that we've learned or seen through the plant materials centers, and also working with other agronomists across the country, and also working with folks in the field. But I tried to focus in, there was a lot of things I could talk about, but I wanted to talk about something that comes up the most often. And I feel like it's one of the most important things when you're using a cover crop, is what's your purpose? Like, what are you trying to accomplish with your cover crop? A lot of times I run across people that don't really have a purpose other than they hear it's good and, hey, this is great for the soil, and oh, I'm using it for soil health. Well, there's a lot of aspects of soil health to consider. There's not just any one piece when you're looking at soil health. A lot of them have been mentioned today by different people on this call. But I'm going to focus, NRCS, we provide cost share, obviously, on a lot of different conservation practices. And one of our ones that we have that's one of the most popular right now is our cover crop practice. It's one of our highest used practices here in the state of Idaho. One of the things that I focus on, any practice that we do with NRCS, we always start with a problem. We start by looking at, hey, what am I trying to solve? And then what tools do I have in the toolbox to try and treat that problem? And that's not always how it comes into us. When folks come to us, a lot of times they come in and they just say, hey, I want to do this practice. And they're not exactly sure why. They just heard it's good and they want to try it. But my experience has been, if you want to have a good experience with cover crops and be sold on the use of cover crops, you want to actually have a purpose going in and a goal in mind that you're trying to accomplish with it. Otherwise, it's just another thing, and you may not ever see the physical benefits. I've seen a lot of folks going after a specific benefit with a cover crop, and then when you sit down and pencil and figure out exactly what's going on and what happened and what all you had to change in your rotation to get that cover crop in there, it turns out they might be negatively impacting the thing that they're trying to fix. So NRCS, just like any of our practice standards, we have a lot of different resource concerns we're trying to address. And this is a list of resource concerns we try and treat with cover crops. These are all possible things that we can fix by using a cover crop. Anything from sheet and rill and wind erosion, to increasing your organic matter, to improving your aggregate stability in the soil, to improve soil organism habitat, reduce water quality degradation by uptaking nutrients that are excess. We can use it to treat weeds, try and suppress weed pressure. We can use it to improve soil moisture, whether it's reduce excess moisture, or in some cases, once you get a cover on the surface, to shade it and provide shading and to preserve the moisture that's already captured in the soil to make it last a little bit longer. And then reducing soil compaction. And there's a couple others that wouldn't fit on here, but like using them for pollinator benefits as well, some other things. So anyway, those are kind of a rundown of the practice purposes NRCS tries to use them for. I don't have enough time to cover all of these today, so I tried to pick out the ones, when I ask people, hey, what is the most common, I asked some of our field staff and area staff, what are the most common reasons people come in for a cover crop? And it's kind of funny, the answers I got was, one of the main ones was, well, I need additional forage for my cows, which is a good reason, and it is a benefit of cover crops, but it's not necessarily our goal of resource conservation. in this particular case. It's not one of our listed resource concerns that this practice is meant for, although we do have other practices, so like some forage and biomass plantings and things that are used for that. But our cover crop practice, although it can be used for that, that's not one of our main goals there. And it also, we do allow grazing and use of the cover crop for feed and forage, but it has to still function for one of these intended purposes. I just picked out probably the top three, the other, besides for forage, the other, one of the main ones people said was they come into the office looking to improve soil health. Well, there's a lot of different aspects of soil health. It takes a lot of, there's a lot of different pieces and parts to soil and fixing all of, to say soil health, there's a lot of things that go into that: chemical, physical properties. You've got your nutrients, you have the microbes and stuff that are working in the soil. There's a lot of different pieces and parts when you start talking soil health. You also have salts and nutrient capacity, and there's a lot of different pieces. But I tried to focus on three of these soil health related ones. The first one, I just kind of listed some of the successes and failures we've had trying to fix some of these resource problems, just stuff that we've seen in the field. The first one is increasing soil organic matter. We have a lot of success with increasing organic matter when you put species out there that put a lot of biomass in the soil. The cover crops are allowed to grow as long as possible, so that you can actually grow enough material to increase the organic matter content. And also when you look at your whole rotation, and you figure out, okay, sometimes people forget, and that's kind of why I have down here some of our failures. Sometimes we don't pay attention to the crop rotation, and we may have had to add some tillage and other things to put the cover crop in, and then we didn't have enough time to grow the cover crop, so it's short, so it doesn't get a lot of biomass. And by the time you put in more tillage and you didn't get much biomass, and you maybe in your tillage removed some crop residue you had, now you're actually losing organic matter rather than gaining. So we've had failures with just not high residue cover crops. We went low residues or stuff that decomposes quickly. We've seen where we put in, like I said, terminate it too soon, or too much tillage, or maybe we removed it too much with grazing, based on what we actually grew. So here's another one for another soil health benefit, is improving habitat for the organisms. Several have mentioned some habitat benefits like cover, make sure you got good cover on the soil surface. You also, it provides protection to that soil surface too, as well as shading and other things. But some of the things that we do see success with too is also diversity, and it's been mentioned here too, crop diversity. So changing up your cover crops and using a mix of different things, different plant types, those are all good things. And then minimizing that soil disturbance so you're not destroying what you've already created. Once you build those root channels and get the aggregates built to where you're starting to add porosity into the soil so it has air and water, to come back in and destroy it again is kind of counterproductive at times. So you try and minimize, you can't always eliminate it, but we try and minimize disturbance. Some of our failures have typically come when where basically tillage comes in and we undo what we've done, right? Or in some cases we put in a monoculture, or I've seen times too where instead of putting that diversity in there, we go out there and the guy already has certain crops in his crop rotation, and we just put another cover crop in that's the same plant family as the crop we just followed, and then we cause what's called green bridge, which basically harbors pests that keep going into the next crop and can be a problem for the next crops. So those are things that we've noticed in some of and tried to avoid in future applications of cover crops. And then compaction. A big thing, the successful ones we've done for compaction are usually We've got fibrous roots in there and also tap roots, because the tap roots kind of penetrate some of those hard compacted layers. And the fibrous roots help to create some of that aggregation that builds those little cottage cheese root balls and other things that kind of create some air pockets and other things in the soil. So it helps to rebuild it. The other thing is allowing those roots to grow longer. The longer you let them grow, the more good they can do at building that soil structure and penetrating into that. Leaving residue on the soil surface to protect it and prevent crusting, because that's another form of compaction. If you have a litter layer on top, it protects from that raindrop impact, and where it doesn't then seal up and start ponding and other things. That layer of protection keeps that raindrop from hitting so hard when it hits the surface. And then some of the failures we've had, I've seen a lot where we've just used a tap-rooted species and that's it. And maybe even at the wrong time of year where that tap root doesn't go down, because, you know, I've done it myself where we planted a radish and we did it as a winter dormant seeding where we waited for it to sprout in the spring, but it basically went through that winter cold period, which basically told that radish to go to bolt and put up a flower, and it never put down a tap root. So the wrong timing can cause problems. And then terminating the cover crop before it gets more than 2 or 3 inches tall doesn't really give you enough time to create that aggregation and other things. Right here on my last slide, I put a few tools that we use. And I mentioned earlier that NRCS usually likes to have a purpose, and we also use tools to identify what that purpose is. So in the case of cover crops, a lot of times our biggest tool is the infield soil health assessment that we use, where we go out, we assess what you currently have, what's the condition of your soil, what's wrong with it, what are things you want to fix, and then we try and come up with practices that will help you to fix that. And the same thing with a cover crop. We might tailor the cover crop to be able to help you fix what you're trying to do. Your local field office should have a soil health bucket that they can help you with many of those, that infield soil health assessment, and show you how to do it. And then we also have a practice now, it's a new one called SEMA 216 that is a soil health testing practice. It's for monitoring. We can actually contract on that and pay you to take soil health tests. And those soil health tests, there's a wide variety of different types of tests you can do. Anything from PLFA, where you're looking at the different microorganisms in the soil, to, you know, some of the other, you know, basic things like soil carbon, which is very similar to standard organic matter test. We also have respiration tests and other lab tests that we can do through that 216. And then our last ones I mentioned there is our WEPS and Russell models. They're kind of primarily designed around erosion protection, but we have organic matter as a consideration in those, because and also tillage. And those are really nice tools, because you can sit down and actually put in the tillage and the planting dates and things like that. And especially WEPS, it'll actually model out your growth of your crop, which will help you kind of time and figure out how much biomass you might be getting by a certain point in the year, and whether your whole crop rotation that you're working with is actually going to end up giving you a net gain in organic matter or a loss. So those are just some tools that we have available. Your local NRCS office can help you evaluate with some of these tools or show you how to use them. And I've put links to all of them on here that we can share if you want. So anyway, that is all I had on the quick and dirty on cover crops. Any questions?
Thank you, Travis.
Travis, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
In one of your slides, you talked about, I think it was under failures, and in that scenario, they had chosen only tap-rooted species for their cover crop mix. Can you talk a bit about why that was?
Well, I
in that
think they
case?
were mainly going after the hardened compacted layers, which they will tend to break up, right? They tend to create those holes and pockets. And so it's not like there's no benefit at all. But it doesn't really rebuild the soil structure itself. It does create some holes and things, but the thing that really helps with aggregation is those fine roots and stuff from some of your cereal grains and other grass crops. So it's nice to put a mix of those in together sometime. It just depends on your goal.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And while we're waiting to see if anybody has any more questions for Travis, Lance Tyson put a question in here for you. Do you remember the rate of the status herbicide you used on your corn?
Ooh, I think it was around 4 ounces, maybe 5 ounces of status.
Awesome. Thanks, Lance. Barry has a comment because Barry does a lot of pasture work. Spring cover crop planting is very valuable as feed during the midsummer slump with cool season pastures. Thank you, Barry. All right. Are there any other questions for any of our speakers before we wrap up? Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, since we're a little past 11:30, we'll just close her up right here. Thank you all so much for attending and all of your great questions. This was a really interactive 5 for 5, which is always fun to see. I'll have this edited and recorded and up on our YouTube, YouTube Soil Health YouTube page, probably next week some point. And then I just wanted to remind you that we'll have one more 5 for 5 on March 26th that Linda Schott is actually putting together on interseeding. So make sure to show up for that one, and we'll start advertising our summer events here soon too. So is there anything else, Lucille, you want to add?
Nah, I think you got it all. Thanks, Courtney.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks everybody so much. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Lucille.
Yeah,
Lance.
thanks to our speakers.
Yes.